Lindsay again, interim minister at First Congregational Church in Port Washington, Wisconsin, here with a Gap Chat, just to talk about a couple issues going on in the church. Nothing grand theological insight or anything quite remarkable. Just wanted to talk with you about what's going on in our church and how some of you are responding in faith to this corona crisis. I should say that Don's not here today. Sorry about that. I always enjoy doing the Gap Chats with Don. He's such a remarkably kind and good thinking man, particularly when it comes to spiritual life and the way he grows in a very genuine way. And I really appreciate the honor and the privilege to be able to talk with him and participate in that with him somewhat. So if you're checking in today and hoping to see Don, I apologize, but I just had a couple of things that I wanted to talk over with you about your church today. So, I've received a couple of phone calls lately where people reach out to me as the minister and they'll say, "Jim, do you know anybody who is suffering financially in our church? Perhaps somebody's lost their job. Because I have a stimulus check here, and to be honest about it, I don't really need it. And I thought if there was somebody in our faith community that could use it, I wanted to be of support to them." My goodness, imagine if you received a phone call like that. Wouldn't you feel honored to know that person, to know their heart, know that they are interested in others to that extent? And wouldn't you feel pretty proud to know that this person is acting in faith in this way, thinking about others, wanting to share some love in that respect? Well, that's how I feel when I receive those phone calls, and I've received a number of those lately. So, it reminds me, I want to read you this, it reminds me of a passage in the Acts of the Apostles. That's actually the second book that Luke wrote. Luke wrote one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that was Luke's story about the earthly life and ministry of Jesus. But then, following Jesus' death and resurrection, Luke wrote the book of Acts, which is the history of the early church. Maybe you knew that. There's a passage in the second chapter of Luke, verses 44 and following, that sort of remind me of what's going on right now. And this is what it says. "And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they sold their possessions and goods and distributed them to all, as any had need." Remind you of what I just said about the stimulus checks? "And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they partook of food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved." I think about the way in which particularly the first century church, the early Christian church, how they saw themselves as so tightly wound and, I was going to say bound up together, but the way in which they were connected in faith even included their finances. I see some of that continuing today, and it makes me joyful. So that's what's going on. Maybe you've been involved in some of those gifts to others that you look out. You know that we've made over 50,000 masks as a church and provided those to help people stay safe during the corona crisis. Maybe you didn't know that some of these masks have been going to the local nursing homes, the fire and police departments, the emergency medical technicians. They've been going downtown Milwaukee to those who ride the mass transit buses, who may not have the money to buy a mask even if they could find one. You all have been involved and your faith is showing. And it makes this interim pastor very proud. Speaking of interim pastor, looks like we have some candidates that seem like great choices to the search committee, and I know that they're coming down the home stretch on this, and hopefully in the next 3 months we'll have a new settled minister in place. In the meantime, there's one other thing I really want you to attend to, and I'm really speaking to those of you today who are members of First Congregational Church. As we go through this transition, this period of change, it's so important to batten down the hatches and to make sure that we're still involved. And it's tough to do that when we're so scattered about. And this dispersion I spoke of right at the beginning of the corona crisis, this dispersion into all different places and how much time we spend separated from one another. We're still a member of that church, and it's so important that we maintain our giving, our involvement, our ministries, the things we do, reaching out and building community, writing notes to one another, making phone calls, emails, texts, taking advantage of all the ways that are available to us of maintaining our sense of community. One thing that has come up in staff lately, and staff holds meetings twice a week over Zoom, electronically, and one thing that we realize that we're now in the month of May, and usually in May, sometimes in June, we hold our spring meeting. And at the spring meeting, one thing that happens is that there's this change in council members. We've been coming up with some names of people that we think might serve well in different capacities. I want you to be thinking of this. I want you to be praying about this, whether you might be a good candidate to serve in a council position. Maybe you'd be a good one to be a chair of one of our committees, or maybe you're just more of a follower and you think that maybe your best gifts might be not as a chair of a committee, but as a member of a committee. Just like those first century Christians in the early church who said, I want to be a part. I'm not a leader, maybe not, but I am one who can give to my church and help support it. If you're looking in on these videos, then chances are that you are involved, and I thank you for that. You know, transition for churches is a tough thing. Tough thing to go from one settled minister to another, and in the middle of all of this have this strange bird called an interim minister. But that's just the boat that we're in. We'll get through it, and as they say, we'll get through it together. But as we move through this time of transition at First Congregational Church in Port Washington, don't you know that we'll get through it much better if everybody takes a hand and puts it to one of the oars, and we'll row that boat together. Because we're all in this together. To be honest with you, it's not my church. Not my church. It's your church. It's our church. And it's going to take all of us. So let me invite you. Think about serving on a committee this next year. If you have that gene in your makeup, then let us know that you have some leadership that you'd be willing to extend and serve in that capacity. Just like the early church, they all shared in common what they had, whether it was financial resources, whether it was food, whether it was time and effort to make sure that the ministries of the church were active and vital. I invite you to think about that in this time, in this place, for you and your faith community that you have invested yourself in. Thank you. One big thank you for making First Congregational Church the church that it is. This is Jim McKenzie without his good buddy Don Niederfrank today, saying it's good to be with you for a Gap Chat. We'll see you soon for worship in the Gap. And in the meantime, stay well, stay safe, and stay faithful. I wish you well. Until later, may God bless you, and may God bless First Congregational Church of Port Washington, Wisconsin.